That morning changed everything, though I didn't know it yet. The morning sunlight was streaming through my kitchen windows, creating a soft glow as it reflected off the white tiles. I must have looked as sick as I felt, my face pale and drawn as I leaned against the counter, trying to ignore the persistent throbbing in my head. This can't go on, I remember thinking to myself, watching my husband Jared prepare Aiden's breakfast. My hands were trembling as I held my teacup, trying to find some comfort in its warmth seeping into my fingers. "Jared," I said, my voice weaker than I'd have liked, "I need you to take Aiden to daycare today." I hated asking for help, but there was no choice. I explained that I wasn't feeling well and needed to go for some tests, adding that while this wasn't his usual routine, I really needed his support. Jared looked up from slicing bread, his eyes finally taking in my exhausted appearance. He assured me he would take Aiden, telling me to rest and not worry, that he'd drop him off before heading to work. He placed his hand on my shoulder in what was meant to be a comforting gesture. I could tell he understood this was outside his normal routine, but he seemed to recognize I needed his support. I nodded gratefully, but something felt off, a mother's intuition, perhaps. I managed a weak smile and thanked him, explaining I just wanted to get these tests done and confirm everything was okay. I promised to rest, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Turning to my little boy, who was happily eating his cereal, I put on my best mom voice. "Aiden, sweetie, Daddy's going to take you to daycare today," I told him, trying to keep things normal. He looked at me with those curious eyes of his and nodded enthusiastically. My heart melted when he cheerfully said he would play lots with his friends, completely unaware of the tension in the air. After they left, I felt that familiar maternal guilt about not being able to care for my son, even though I knew taking care of my health was necessary for our family's well-being. I started getting ready for the doctor's appointment, each movement bringing a new wave of exhaustion. Looking in the mirror, I whispered a small prayer, "Please let it be nothing serious." My reflection showed sunken eyes and skin paler than usual. Taking a deep breath, I called my lifelong friend Laura. My voice shook slightly as I asked if she could accompany me to the tests, admitting I needed someone there with me. Laura, bless her heart, responded exactly as she always has throughout our 30-year friendship, immediately agreeing to be there in 15 minutes. When I hung up, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Laura had always been my rock through difficult times, the kind of friendship that's rarer than gold. We arrived at the hospital together, and Laura, trying to distract me, reminded me of the wonderful little cafe we'd discovered after my last routine checkup. She suggested we might find another hidden gem today. Despite my nervousness, I managed to smile. I squeezed her hand as we entered the waiting room, telling her how grateful I was for her presence. Laura's friendship had always brought a sense of normalcy to even the most challenging situations. She gently squeezed my hand back, her voice full of determination as she told me we'd handle this together. She wanted to focus on the tests first, then talk about everything else afterward, making sure I was okay. The tests went quickly, but time seemed to crawl by as I sat there waiting. My mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. How would I take care of Aiden and keep working if something was seriously wrong? Laura sat next to me, and I could feel her watching my worried face with concern. She squeezed my hand and reminded me that whatever the results, we would face it together. She always knew exactly what to say, telling me I was strong and would find a way through this. "Just breathe," she told me, "don't let fear take over." Finally, the doctor came in with my results. Relief flooded through me as she explained it was just an infection that could be treated with medication and rest. She recommended taking a few days off to recover, her smile reassuring as she explained the treatment plan. I thanked her, feeling the tension start to ease from my shoulders. Laura smiled too, clearly as relieved as I was. She suggested we get coffee and talk, mentioning she had some thoughts about Jared and me that she wanted to discuss. We found a quiet corner table at a nearby cafe, the kind of private spot where you can really talk. Looking at Laura, I knew I could tell her anything. My voice cracked as I confessed that things weren't good between Jared and me anymore. I explained how distant he'd become, like we were living in separate worlds. Even that morning, when I'd asked him to take Aiden to daycare, I'd seen hesitation in his eyes. I don't know how to reach him anymore, I admitted, fighting back tears. Laura listened carefully, nodding with the understanding that comes from decades of friendship. She'd noticed how much I'd been carrying alone, she told me. While Jared had always been a good husband, she could see he was struggling with something. She suggested we needed to have an honest conversation, reminding me I couldn't handle everything by myself. I sighed, feeling overwhelmed by it all. I know, I told her, but every time we try to talk, it turns into an argument. The last thing I wanted was for Aiden to see us fighting. I wanted him to grow up in a safe, loving home, but how could I guarantee that when I felt like I was falling apart myself? Laura's words were like a warm embrace. She reminded me that I was a good mother, doing my absolute best. She told me to stop blaming myself for everything, that it was okay to ask for help, and accept that I couldn't control everything. We'll figure this out together, she promised, and remember, you're never alone. She took my hand, and we started planning how to tackle this situation one step at a time. After coffee, I felt a bit more hopeful, thanking Laura for her support before heading home to see Aiden and Jared. But when I arrived, the house was eerily quiet, and my heart started pounding when I realized Aiden wasn't there. With trembling hands, I called the daycare, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked if Aiden had arrived safely that morning. The response hit me like a physical blow. They told me Aiden hadn't come to daycare at all, they hadn't heard anything about him today. The ground seemed to disappear beneath my feet. What do you mean he's not there? Jared was supposed to take him, I managed to say, my thoughts spinning out of control. I tried calling Jared, but there was no answer. Desperation took over as I thought about what might have happened, trying desperately to stay calm enough to think clearly. With shaking hands, I called Laura again. Laura, I said, my voice trembling with fear, Aiden never made it to daycare. I told her Jared wasn't answering his phone and that I was terrified. Laura immediately took charge, telling me she was on her way. She told me to stay calm and not jump to conclusions, that we would figure this out together. We agreed to meet at my house, and I knew Laura understood the gravity of the situation. While I waited, I tried to keep my thoughts rational, but my worry for my son was overwhelming. Time seemed to stand still as I waited, every mother's worst nightmare playing through my mind. Where are you, Aiden? Please be safe, I kept thinking while waiting for Laura. She arrived in such a hurry she could barely park her car, rushing to my door and knocking urgently. When I opened it, my face was a mess of tears and desperation. Laura quickly came inside, asking what had happened and where Aiden was. I couldn't hold back my tears as I explained that Jared was supposed to take him to daycare, but he never arrived, and now Jared wasn't answering his phone. I was falling apart, terrified he might have been in an accident. Laura took my face in her hands and did something she'd never done before. She gave me a light but firm slap on the cheek. Focus, she said firmly, this won't help Aiden. We need to think rationally and act quickly. Let's call the security desk at Jared's workplace. The slap and Laura's urgent tone helped clear my head a bit. With trembling hands, I agreed we needed to check where he might be. Laura took charge, quickly dialing Jared's workplace and asking security to check if he was in the building. The security desk responded immediately to the urgency in her voice, asking for Jared's car number. I managed to give them the number XWXIL 334, begging them to check quickly. Those next few minutes felt like an eternity as we waited for them to call back. When the phone finally rang, the news hit me like a tsunami. They had found Jared's car in the parking lot, with Aiden unconscious inside. They were rushing him to the general hospital. My legs nearly gave out, but I forced myself to move. I told Laura they'd found Aiden, that he'd been in the car the whole time. We rushed to the door, Laura guiding me to her car. During that frantic drive to the hospital, my thoughts were spinning out of control. How could this happen? Jared was supposed to take him to daycare. How could he forget our son in the car? If anything happened to Aiden, I would never forgive myself. Or Jared. Laura tried to calm me while driving, holding my hand with her free one. She reminded me to breathe, that Aiden was getting help, that I needed to be strong for him. She mentioned my brother, and my heart clenched even tighter. At the hospital, we saw the medical team rushing Aiden to the emergency room. Seeing my son unconscious was like a knife to my heart. I begged them to save my son as I followed the doctors. Laura stayed by my side, trying to keep me calm, reminding me to trust the doctors. As we sat waiting for news, I gripped Laura's hand tightly. The memory of my brother came flooding back. He had died the same way, forgotten in a car. I can't lose Aiden like I lost my brother, I told Laura, my voice breaking with old and new pain mixed together. Laura squeezed my hand, offering what comfort she could. After what felt like hours, but was probably just minutes, the doctor appeared with news that Aiden was stable but needed observation. Thank God, I whispered, feeling a small wave of relief. Then Jared arrived at the hospital, his face full of guilt and anxiety. Jared started to explain it was a horrible accident, that he'd been distracted by work and financial problems, but I cut him off. You left our son in the car, I said, my voice shaking with rage and pain. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could he have done this? My own brother had died this way, and now the same thing had almost happened to Aiden. I told him I couldn't trust him anymore, that he needed to stay away from us. When Jared tried to come closer, Laura stepped between us. She told him firmly that I'd asked him to leave, that he should wait in the waiting room. After he left silently, I collapsed into Laura's arms, overwhelmed by anger and grief. Laura, I don't know what to do, I sobbed. I couldn't understand how he could do this to me, wondering if there was something else he wasn't telling me. He'd been so distracted lately, it felt like something else was going on. Laura held me tight, trying to calm me down. She agreed something wasn't right, noting how Jared had mentioned financial problems. She reminded me to focus on Aiden right now, that he needed me to be strong. We'll get through this together, I promise, she assured me, giving me what strength she could. We held each other, trying to process everything that had happened. Though I was still terrified for Aiden, Laura's presence provided some comfort. Jared waited on the other side of the room, his face heavy with guilt and shame. I could barely stand as we waited for news about Aiden, with Laura as my quiet but steady support. Finally, the doctor appeared with relieving news. Aiden was stable, though severely dehydrated. He was responding well to treatment and would make a full recovery with some observation. I felt some of the weight lift from my shoulders. Can I see him? I asked, my voice thick with emotion. The doctor nodded and led us to Aiden's room. When I saw him lying there, still pale but breathing steadily, I carefully approached and took his small hand. You're safe now, sweetheart, I whispered, feeling tears of relief roll down my face. Laura supported my arm as she stood beside me. When Jared entered the room later, he looked devastated. He stopped at the door, looking from Aiden to me. I'm so sorry, Caitlin. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice full of guilt. I couldn't even look at him, the anger and pain were still too raw. That night, after hours of tension and relief mixed together, we returned home. The silence between us was almost tangible. Jared tried to start a conversation, but I was too emotionally exhausted to deal with it. The next morning, I was awakened by a phone call. It was Derek, Jared's friend, asking about money Jared had borrowed. I frowned in confusion, asking what money he was talking about. Derek hesitated before explaining that Jared had borrowed a significant amount from him and hadn't paid it back. After promising to check with Jared, I hung up, feeling a growing sense of unease. What else was Jared hiding from me? Later that day, Laura suggested we go to the shopping mall for some distraction and new clothes. She insisted that doing something normal would help lift my spirits. "Come on, Caitlin," she said with an encouraging smile, "you need a break from all this stress." Though I was still worried, I agreed to go. At the mall, we wandered through racks of clothes, trying things on and laughing together, trying to forget our troubles for a moment. Laura held up a red blouse against me, telling me it was perfect and I should buy it. I smiled, enjoying this moment of normalcy. "I'll take it," I said, "it feels good to do something different for a while." But when we got to the register, my card was declined. Declined? I tried it again, but got the same result. Laura noticed my tense expression and stepped closer. She offered to use her card, telling me not to worry, that it was probably just a bank error we could sort out later. I accepted her offer, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. There should have been plenty of money in the account, especially right after payday. After shopping, I sat on a bench with Laura and checked my bank app. "This isn't right," I muttered, seeing multiple transfers I didn't recognize. Large sums had been withdrawn, leaving the balance far lower than it should have been. I told Laura about the strange transfers, feeling my anxiety rising. She looked at my phone screen and saw the suspicious transactions. "You need to talk to Jared about this," she said, promising to be there if I needed anything. When I got home, I confronted Jared with the bank statements. I demanded to know why there were so many transfers from our account that I hadn't made. Jared's face went pale when he saw the statements. He knew he couldn't hide the truth anymore. Then came the confession that changed everything. He had a gambling problem and was deep in debt. He'd been using our money to pay off gambling debts, being threatened by the people he owed. I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet again. "How could you do this, Jared?" I asked, my voice full of pain and anger. Our family was in danger, and Aiden had almost lost his life due to Jared's negligence. When he tried to come closer, I backed away, telling him I needed time to think. That night, I called Laura and told her everything. I explained about Jared's gambling debts and the angry creditors, terrified of what this meant for us. Laura, always my faithful friend, tried to calm me down. She assured me we'd find a solution, reminding me I wasn't alone. After putting Aiden to bed, I sat in the living room, staring into space. Though worried, I knew I had to be strong. I needed to protect my son and find a way out of this situation. Laura was right, I wasn't alone, and I would get through this. The night was quiet, but my mind was churning with emotions and fears about the future. The next morning, I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy while preparing breakfast. The soft morning sunlight filled the kitchen, but the air was thick with tension. I watched Aiden fidgeting at the table while Jared pretended to read the newspaper. My movements felt mechanical as I set the plates down, my mind still reeling from last night's confession. "Eat your cereal, sweetheart," I said to Aiden, trying to keep my voice steady. I sat down and looked at Jared, telling him we needed to talk about the money. He lowered his newspaper, his face tense as he claimed he just needed more time to fix things. I felt anger rising inside me. More time. I asked, you're putting our family in danger. These debts won't just disappear. And what about leaving Aiden in the car? How could you forget our son? I can't trust you anymore. Aiden looked between us, too young to understand the gravity of the situation. Daddy, you won't forget me again, will you? He asked innocently. I watched Jared stare at our son, guilt written all over his face. His promise to never forget again sounded hollow to my ears. The argument continued, every word filled with frustration and pain. Finally, Jared stood up and grabbed his work bag, saying coldly that he couldn't fix everything right now. After giving Aiden a quick kiss, he left, leaving heavy silence in the kitchen. I took a deep breath and picked up Aiden's backpack. Let's go, sweetie. Time for daycare, I said, forcing cheerfulness into my voice. After dropping Aiden off, I drove to meet Laura at our usual coffee shop. She was already waiting with a warm cup of coffee and that reassuring smile of hers. Sit down, Caitlin. Let's figure this out, she said. I sat down gratefully, thankful for her constant presence in my life. My hands shook as I held my coffee cup, telling her I didn't know where to start. Laura pulled out a notebook and pen, suggesting we first get clear about our financial situation. As we discussed financial independence, I wondered aloud how I would support Aiden and myself without Jared. That's when Laura shared something I'd never known about her. She told me her ex-husband had also struggled with debt and addiction. I looked at her with new respect, asking how she'd gotten through it. She squeezed my hand tight, telling me about the support system that had helped her survive. You're not alone, she assured me, we'll get through this together. Later, while we were still talking, a voicemail message interrupted our conversation. Derek's voice was full of urgency as he threatened to start taking things from our house if Jared didn't pay. I felt a chill run down my spine. Derek's words were a direct threat to our safety. I looked at Laura after hanging up the phone, telling her Jared needed to leave. Laura nodded in solidarity, agreeing he needed to deal with his problems away from Aiden and me. That night, after Laura left, the house felt empty without Jared. I waited for him, determined to face this confrontation. Hours later, he stumbled in, clearly drunk. Jared, we need to talk, I said firmly. I told him he had to leave, that I couldn't take any more of this danger he was bringing to our family. He looked at me with clouded eyes, his voice full of resentment and anger as he claimed I couldn't throw him out. He threatened to take everything if I tried to force him out. I felt a mix of anger and sadness at his words. You've already taken everything, Jared, I said as I started packing his things. Despite his protests, I stood firm. I told him to leave and fix his problems, that I wouldn't let him ruin our lives anymore. He stumbled out, a shadow of the man he once was. After closing the door, I took a deep breath to steady my nerves. I went upstairs to Aiden's room, where he was sleeping peacefully. Sitting beside him, I stroked his hair, explaining that Daddy needed to go away for a while. He stirred slightly, blinking up at me. Will I see Daddy again? He asked sleepily. My heart clenched at his question. I promised him he would, though I wasn't sure myself, assuring him that Daddy loved him and I would always be there. The future was uncertain, but I had to stay hopeful for Aiden's sake. After tucking him back in, I went downstairs and called Laura. My voice shook as I told her I'd made Jared leave. Laura reassured me I'd done the right thing, promising we'd figure this out together. After hanging up, I looked around the quiet house. I was exhausted but determined. I knew the days ahead would be difficult, but I was ready to face anything to protect my son and rebuild our lives. With Laura's support, I knew I could overcome any obstacle. 2 days after I'd made Jared leave, I was desperately searching for work to secure a stable future for Aiden and myself. The phone rang, bringing me back to reality. It was Barbara, the social worker.
In a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, Jared sat on the edge of the threadbare bed, his once confident demeanor now shattered by sleepless nights and too many drinks. His bloodshot eyes reflected the harsh fluorescent light as he dialed the number for Child Protective Services. Barbara's professional voice cut through the static of the phone line, identifying herself as a CPS representative. With calculated precision, Jared wove his tale of concern about Caitlin's ability to care for their son Aiden. His voice carried the weight of false authority as he claimed she was unemployed and unable to provide for their child. Barbara's pen scratched across her notepad as she listened intently to every word. She assured him they would investigate the situation thoroughly, promising to visit Caitlin's home and evaluate the circumstances. Her calm, measured response gave no indication of judgment either way. Jared ended the call with practiced gratitude, claiming concern for his son's safety. In the dim light of the motel room, a twisted smile played across his face as he contemplated regaining control through this new strategy. The air conditioner hummed in the background, a monotonous soundtrack to his desperate attempt at manipulation. His reflection in the mirror showed a man barely recognizable from the successful businessman he'd once been, now reduced to plotting in a budget motel room. The shadows under his eyes told stories of countless nights spent at the gambling tables instead of with his family. Yet in his alcohol-clouded mind, he saw this as his path back to power, back to the life he'd lost through his own destructive choices. The irony of claiming to protect his son while plotting from a dingy motel room was lost on him.
That afternoon, when I opened my door to find Barbara from Child Protective Services standing there, my heart nearly stopped. She was an imposing figure with her blonde hair, pulled back in a tight bun, and those piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. My hands trembled slightly as she explained she was here to evaluate my ability to care for Aiden, her notebook and pen already poised to document everything. I felt like I was being put on trial in my own home, but I forced myself to stay composed. I invited her in, trying to sound confident as I explained that I was doing everything possible for Aiden and actively searching for work. The ticking of the kitchen clock seemed abnormally loud as Barbara began her detailed questioning. She wanted to know about my financial situation, how I was managing household expenses and Aiden's needs. I explained about using my savings and the invaluable help from Laura, my voice steadier than I felt inside. I told her about the resumes I'd prepared, ready to distribute all over town. With each question, I felt like I was walking on eggshells. When she asked about Aiden's routine and daycare attendance, I described our daily schedule, emphasizing how I was maintaining stability despite our circumstances. I could feel sweat forming on my palms as I tried to convince her I was doing my absolute best. Barbara's pen scratched across her notepad as she made notes, her professional demeanor never wavering. My heart sank when she finally looked up and told me that good intentions might not be enough. Her words about needing more concrete evidence of my ability to provide a stable environment for Aiden felt like a physical blow. I'd faced many challenges in my life, but nothing had prepared me for having to prove I was a good mother.
In a dimly lit downtown bar, Jared nursed his fourth whiskey of the evening. Each burning sip fueled the dangerous cocktail of rage and anxiety brewing inside him. The polished mahogany bar reflected his increasingly dark expression as he plotted his revenge. "She thinks she can take everything from me," he muttered into his glass, his once handsome features twisted with bitterness. His thoughts spiraled darker with each drink, consumed by plans to destroy everything Caitlin held dear. He would show her who was really in control, prove his dominance one final time. The man he had once been, successful, respected, in control, was slipping away with each passing moment. His reflection in the bar mirror showed a stranger, someone consumed by destructive impulses and wounded pride. The bartender watched warily as Jared sank deeper into his self-destructive spiral. Each drink marked another step away from redemption, another nail in the coffin of his former life. The evening shadows lengthened across the bar, matching the growing darkness in Jared's soul. His once steady hands now trembled with suppressed rage and the effects of too much alcohol. The remnants of his former self were drowning in a sea of bitter resentment and wounded pride. In the soft glow of the bar lights, Jared was becoming something dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose. The sweet whisper of revenge was his only companion now, leading him further down a path from which there might be no return.
Just then, Laura burst through my door, ready to be my advocate. I had called her earlier to explain the situation with Barbara from CPS, and she came prepared to stand up for me. Laura's energy filled the room as she introduced herself to Barbara, passionately describing how hard I was working to care for Aiden. She explained that I just needed a little more time to get back on my feet. Barbara listened thoughtfully to Laura's words, considering them carefully. Before leaving, Barbara told us she would give me some time to get things in order, though she would be monitoring the situation closely. When she left, Laura and I both exhaled in relief. I hugged my friend tightly, telling her I didn't know what I'd do without her. With her characteristic optimism, Laura suggested we focus on finding me a job, planning to start distributing resumes the next day. The following morning, after dropping Aiden at daycare, Laura and I hit the streets with my resumes. We went from business to business, explaining my situation and dropping off applications. Laura kept encouraging me, reminding me of my qualifications and work ethic. After a long day of walking and job hunting, I managed to secure 2 interviews. On the drive home, Laura declared this was a good sign, that we were on the right path. I felt a tiny spark of hope growing inside me. The road ahead would be tough, but with Laura by my side, I felt I could face anything. In the car, I couldn't help thinking about the interviews and what they could mean for our future. I knew that landing either job would change everything for us. Aiden needed stability and security, and I was determined to provide it. Laura squeezed my hand gently, telling me what a wonderful mother and friend I was. She promised we'd get through this together, that she'd be there no matter what. When we got home, I looked at our house with new eyes. Every detail, every effort to maintain our home suddenly seemed more meaningful. I thanked Laura again, feeling ready to face tomorrow's challenges. The next morning, I woke up with butterflies in my stomach. It was my first interview. I carefully chose a professional but comfortable outfit and got ready meticulously. During breakfast, I tried to keep things light with Aiden. I told him about my important interview, asking him to wish me luck. His innocent enthusiasm warmed my heart as he assured me everything would be fine. After dropping him at daycare, I headed to the interview location. My stomach was in knots when I arrived, but I held on to my determination. The receptionist greeted me with a kind smile. I worked to keep my voice steady as I announced myself for the 10 a.m. interview. My heart sank as I watched her expression change while checking the schedule. She apologetically informed me that the interview had been canceled due to last-minute changes. I felt shocked and couldn't hide my disappointment as I asked about the lack of notice. She offered to reschedule, still wearing an apologetic smile. As I left the building, the weight of disappointment pressed down on me. I told myself I couldn't let this setback affect me, trying to hold on to hope. I still had one more interview, but I couldn't shake the fear that it would end the same way. The next morning, I woke up early, determined to make this second interview count. After dropping Aiden at daycare again, I headed to the interview location, with even more butterflies in my stomach than before. This time, the HR manager greeted me warmly, inviting me to the interview room and expressing interest in getting to know me. During the interview, I found my confidence growing as I answered questions and highlighted my qualifications and experience. I told her how genuinely interested I was in the position and how much I believed I could contribute to their team. When she smiled and told me my resume was exactly what they were looking for, I could hardly believe it. She extended her hand, saying they wanted to offer me the position pending some final checks. Relief and joy washed over me as I shook her hand, promising to give it my all. Later that day, Barbara from CPS arrived for another home visit, and Jared showed up too, desperate to gain custody of Aiden. Barbara explained she was here to assess the situation and hear both sides. Jared went first, putting on a show of concern as he claimed I was unemployed and in debt, unable to care for our son. Taking a deep breath to stay calm, I countered his lies. I explained I just found a job and was working hard to stabilize our finances, while Jared was the one with serious gambling and drinking problems who had put Aiden in danger. Before Barbara could respond, Derek burst in with two large men, creating instant tension in the room. Barbara jumped up, demanding to know who they were. Derek explained bluntly that Jared owed them a substantial amount of money and they would start taking his property if he didn't pay. I watched Barbara's face change as she turned to Jared, asking if he was really seeking custody while hiding such massive debts. Aiden watched everything with wide, frightened eyes. Derek, noticing Aiden, softened his tone and led his men out, saying they'd handle this another way. Barbara had seen enough. She told Jared he clearly wasn't fit to care for our son and that she would take measures to ensure Aiden's safety with me. Jared slammed the door as he left, shouting threats about taking everything from me. I felt a mix of relief and sadness wash over me. Barbara turned to me with compassion, explaining she would file a protection order for Aiden and me. My voice trembled as I thanked her, telling her all I wanted was for Aiden to be safe. Later that day, I picked up Aiden from daycare, my mind wrestling with how to explain the situation with his father. When we got home, I sat with him on the sofa, trying to find the right words. I explained as gently as I could that Daddy had some problems to solve and would be away for a while, but that he loved Aiden very much. My heart broke when Aiden looked at me, with confused eyes, asking if he would see his father again. I forced a smile, squeezing his small hand as I told him that Daddy needed time to fix things but loved him always. His innocent response about hoping his daddy would get better brought tears to my eyes. I hugged him close, feeling both relieved and sad. The road ahead would be difficult, but I was determined to do whatever necessary to protect him and secure our future. Laura's support and the new protection order made me feel safer about facing the challenges ahead. After putting Aiden to bed, I sank onto the living room sofa, exhausted but resolute. I called Laura, asking her to come over to discuss something important. She arrived quickly, concerned about Aiden. When I told her I decided to sell the house, she looked shocked. She questioned why I would sell a home filled with so many memories. I explained my decision with determination. I would use the money to pay off Jared's gambling debts. I wanted a fresh start for Aiden and me somewhere peaceful. Derek had been honest about the debts, unlike Jared, and deserved to be paid. The sale would free us completely from Jared, and maybe that freedom would help him recover too. Laura shook her head, saying it wasn't fair for me to pay his debts. I smiled at her concern, explaining that Derek wasn't the villain, he just wanted what was owed. The sale would give us a fresh start, and both Aiden and I needed that peace. Laura hugged me, feeling my strength and determination. She promised to support my decision and help find us a new home. Over the next few days, I prepared to sell the house and began searching for a smaller but comfortable new home. Laura stayed by my side through it all, helping with house viewings and watching Aiden when needed. Finally, we found a small but cozy house in a quiet neighborhood. Aiden fell in love with it immediately, exploring every corner with excitement. When he asked about planting a garden, I felt a wave of joy and relief. Before moving, I met Derek at a cafe to settle Jared's debts. He seemed surprised and grateful when I handed him the envelope of money. I explained that while the debt wasn't mine, I respected his honesty. Derek thanked me sincerely, apologizing for the trouble and offering future help if needed. After the move, our lives began to stabilize. I threw myself into my new job, finding satisfaction in work and daily routines. Laura visited often, her friendship and support never wavering.
Meanwhile, Jared, once a proud and successful man, continued his downward spiral into the dark depths of gambling and alcohol. His handsome features had grown haggard, his once steady hands now trembling as he nursed his drinks in seedy bars. He failed to appreciate Caitlin's generous gesture, his pride too wounded to acknowledge her sacrifice. His supervised monthly visits with Aiden became painful reminders of all he had lost through his own destructive choices. The darkness that had consumed him showed no signs of lifting, as he chose the cold embrace of addiction over the warmth of redemption. In the dim light of various bars, he had become a shadow of his former self, his life a cautionary tale of pride and self-destruction. Each passing day found him further from the man he once was, trapped in a prison of his own making. His path continued to wind deeper into the shadows, each step taking him further from the light of redemption. The man who had once commanded respect in boardrooms now found his only companion in the bottom of a glass.
A year after everything had settled, I decided it was time for a meeting between Jared, Laura, and me. I wanted to establish some kind of family structure for Aiden's sake. We chose to meet at the park, a neutral ground where we could talk openly. When Jared arrived, he looked exhausted but was trying to maintain a facade of normalcy. Laura was there, as always, providing her steady support. I kept my voice firm but gentle as I told Jared I was glad he came, explaining we needed to talk about Aiden and our path forward. Jared sighed, finally seeming ready to face reality. He admitted to his failures, telling us that despite appearances, he wanted what was best for his son. He wanted to be part of Aiden's life, but acknowledged he needed to make many changes. Laura spoke up then, her voice calm but resolute. She reminded Jared that while we all wanted what was best for Aiden, he needed to commit to real change. She pointed out the sacrifices I'd made to set things right. The conversation was long and honest, perhaps our first truly honest conversation in years. Finally, Jared agreed to seek treatment for his addiction and promised to work on his recovery. With Laura's support, I set clear boundaries while still leaving room for a healthy relationship between father and son. As our meeting drew to a close, we sat on a park bench watching Aiden play. I felt hope rising in my chest as I expressed my wish to give Aiden the best possible life. Jared agreed, his eyes filled with emotion as he promised to become the father Aiden needed. For the first time in a long while, I felt life was moving in the right direction. Though I knew we had a long road ahead, I believed that with Laura's support and Jared's commitment to change, we could overcome any obstacle for Aiden's sake. The future looked brighter now, with Aiden surrounded by people who truly loved and were dedicated to him. If you've enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these touching stories to you regularly. Don't miss our next amazing story coming soon to your screen. We truly value your support. Until we meet again.